It's great to see you guys. Like Sean said, we are in week 2 of our series, Outside the Walls, and all throughout the month of November, we are working together to meet the needs of people and organizations in our community. And it's so cool because all of that is to endear Church at the Creek to our community by loving others and using our resources to love them, our time to love on them. And this is so cool. Actually, just yesterday, our student ministry, we had our Outside the Walls Serve Day event. A big group of us went down to Mission Arlington, and our students crushed it. They did so good. Mission Arlington, and this is really cool, they give out over 25,000 free Thanksgiving meals every year. And so we got to go help them prepare for that. And so our students spent the entire day going door to door, knocking on strangers' doors in the communities that they minister to, and asking people if they needed food for Thanksgiving. And it was so cool. So many people signed up. They went to over 100 apartments and 280 mobile homes throughout the day. I mean, they were crushing. Yeah, it's so cool. Yeah. And so, super excited. I'm a little tired today from that, so if I seem a little sluggish, I apologize, but we had a blast. And let me just say this, it's great to be back in here with you guys. I don't know if you know this, we started our middle school ministry, Transit, that meets on Sunday mornings now, just about 3 months ago. And so I haven't been in the room in a while. I've been in Transit. We have a blast in there. I'm actually a little sad that I'm not in there with them today, but they're in there unsupervised right now. So I'm sure they're having a great time. No, their leaders are with them. They are with them. So, hey, if you're a middle schooler in the room, though, and you have not given Transit a shot yet, we do have a lot of fun. And so you need to check it out. But I'm also really glad to be back in here with you guys. It's like I said, it's been a little over 3 months since I've taught in here on a Sunday, and I miss teaching to you guys. I really do. I love teaching with you guys, and it's so much fun. Actually, I was talking with Sheridan earlier this week, and I heard her laugh. She already knows where this is going. And she's just like, "Oh, you're teaching this week." And I was like, "Yeah, I am." She's like, "I actually like when you teach." I was like, "Thank you so much. You didn't have to say actually." Like you were surprised that you liked it, but I appreciate that, and so I hope with you guys, I hope the feeling is mutual. No, I really do love being in here with you guys, and so I love it. But what my normal Sunday looks a little different, and so today is going to be fun because typically I teach twice on a Sunday. I teach in Transit in Sunday morning, and then our Inside Out service, our high school service that happens on Sunday evenings, I teach there. But there's something special about teaching to you guys because you guys think I'm funny. You do. Because high schoolers don't think I'm funny. Like they tell me, "Oh, you're funny." But then they don't laugh at any of my jokes when I teach, which is tough because they're too cool to laugh at my jokes. But you guys aren't, so appreciate that. So thank you for not being that cool. No, we love you. And then I teach in Transit on Sunday mornings. I teach the middle schoolers, and they think everything's funny. So it doesn't really feel that gratifying when they laugh. But you guys think I'm funny. Last time I taught in here, this is crazy. Last time I taught in here, I taught on the Beatitudes, so these 9 blessings that Jesus gives at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And my intro to this message, really the first 10 to 15 minutes of this message, I spent talking about how I'm kind of dumb and I'm not really good at reading. And you guys loved that. Like, y'all loved it. I was like, that's crazy. I don't know how I connected one to the other. I really have no idea. It's been a while, and I cannot remember. But I was just like, hey, I can't really read good. And you're like, that guy's awesome. He's crushing it. I'm honestly shocked that Pastor Mark asked me to teach again after that, but here we are. So I thought to myself, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So buckle up, folks. We are in for a wild ride today. But let me just kick off with this question. May seem like a left turn, but you'll see where we're going. What do you spend most of your time thinking about? Throughout your week, throughout your day, what do you spend most of your time thinking about? You probably say your work, your family, your finances, and there's so many good things to think about. But if you're anything like me, maybe there's some of us in the room, I spend a whole lot of time thinking about absolutely nothing. It's my favorite thing in the world to think about because it's just like a little brain break. You just kind of go into this zone. You don't have to think. And it's a lot of fun. And a few months back, actually, Mark had our whole staff take this personality test called the Strengths Finders. And the whole premise of Strengths Finders, it's got 34 different strengths, and it's going to tell you your top 5 strengths. And the whole premise, it's only the best. These are your strengths. This is what you do good. It's going to hype you up. It's going to be great. And so we took it, and they break these 34 strengths into 4 categories. You got relationship building, you've got influencing, executing, and strategic thinking. And so we get our results back, and my top 5 strengths were made up of a combination of things in the influencing and the relationship building category. So things like adaptability, things like winning other people over, communication, teaching from stage, they say is one of my strengths. You may disagree, but actually Sheridan, she thinks it is a strength. So that was very kind of her. But it's all in that relationship influencing category. But they do something sneaky, is what they do, because they say it's all about your top 5 strengths. But then after you take the test, they say, well, if you pay us like $80 more, you can actually see all your strengths. It's like, well, they're not all strengths. Like, I'm not that silly to think that they're all strengths. And I don't care about number 6 through 10. I'm not really interested in, like, what's my next best. Like, I want to know 30 through 34. I want to know my least best strength. Which I would call a weakness, they wouldn't. But so I'm like, all right, so we do it. So we're like, we got to see all the strengths. And I get my results, and my top 15 is primarily made up of like a lot of the same. But really, like once you get past 15, it's probably not a strength anymore. This is not something I'm very good at. And once you get in the 30s, this is something I've got to be really, really bad at. And every single one of my strengths in the bottom half, like everything from like 25 down, the last ones were all from the strategic thinking category, which is, kind of embarrassing because you could safely assume that this test just told me, you may be dumb as a box of rocks, but you're a good time. And maybe you think that's a little bit of an overreaction or a stretch, but it gets worse. It does. Because my 33rd strength, number 33 out of 34, so my second least best, how they would say that, is this, intellect. Which is crazy, because how does a personality test know I'm dumb? Like, there was no math questions on this test, but they have said, no, that's not a strength of yours. And so we're in the office and we're talking about our full list. Mark and I were talking, and he says, man, I hate looking at my bottom 5 strengths because it kind of feels like the test is telling me just like, you're a loser, you're a loser, you're a loser, you're a loser, you're a loser. I said, well, that's better than mine, because mine says you're a loser, you're a loser, you're a loser. You're an idiot, and you're a loser. And we paid more money to learn this. That's the tough part. Anyways, I started researching, and they give kind of blurbs about each of the strengths. And so I was like, well, what does intellect really even mean? Because I obviously don't know. And I read the way that Strengths Finders defines intellect, and honestly, it was actually pretty accurate. It says this: you like to think. No. You like mental activity. No, I don't. You like exercising the muscles of your brain. That doesn't even make sense. And this need for mental activity may be focused, for example. You may be trying to understand another person's feelings. Definitely not. So my first thought after reading that was like, okay, that's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. But my second thought was like, hey, guys, call it something else. Like, that's not what that means. There's a big difference between being a big dummy and just not liking to think all the time. I think, at least. I would say call it thinker or learner. Like, those are good names for those categories. And so I looked, and actually those are already categories that I scored very low in. So I don't really know what to do with this anymore. Anyways, that's that. But all that to be said, it is very accurate. I hate to think if I don't have to. I love going home, turning off my brain. That moment, maybe you've experienced this, maybe not, but like when the inside of your brain just kind of feels like TV static, like there's no thoughts, no sounds, just kind of like fuzz. You're like, that's the sweet spot. That's where I want to live. And my wife, Savannah, she doesn't do this. She thinks a lot. Like, she thinks all the time. Like, she never doesn't think, which is crazy to me. And she thinks about so many different things constantly. That's crazy. It exhausts me thinking about how much she thinks. That's too much mental effort. And sometimes she'll look at me and she'll see me and she'll say, "You look like you're deep in thought." What are you thinking about? And the truth is, I haven't been further from a thought for the last 30 minutes. Like, I haven't sniffed a thought in a while. And, but I get embarrassed, and I feel like I should be thinking about something. And so this is terrible, but I lie. I know I shouldn't, but I do. So I just make up the first thing that comes to mind. And so I just the natural answer is just like, what have you been thinking about? You just the Roman Empire. It's crazy. Did you know that at their peak, their population was 20% of the world's population? It's just astounding. Mind-boggling to think about. I've spent a lot of extra mental energy just stewing on that today. And so, I don't know. I start there. It's such a weird place to start, but we ask that question. We think about wildly different things. Maybe your home is similar to mine. Maybe you like to think. Maybe you don't like to think. Maybe you find yourself somewhere in the middle. But what about you? What do you spend most of your time thinking about? Maybe it's your favorite sports team. Maybe it's your job. Maybe you've got kids who are grown and out of the house, and you spend a lot of time just thinking about them. Maybe you're worried about the future. Maybe you're worried about who you're going to date or marry. Maybe you're worried about what you're going to do with your future. I mean, there's so many things that we have to think about, and all of these are very normal and can be good things to think about. But when I ask that question, what do you spend most of your time thinking about? Here's what no one in the room said. My neighbor. And we may wish we thought about our neighbor more, or we may think it's a good idea to think about our neighbor, but many of us spend much of our energy thinking about our own lives and our own problems and our own interests. And the truth is, it's easy to ignore our neighbor, right? We're tired, we're busy, we've got our own families to worry about, and so do they. I mean, some of us, we don't even know our neighbors, so how could we think about them? But here's the problem that we face with that. If we don't know our neighbors, how in the world could we meet their needs? And here's another thought for you. It's easy to ignore a neighbor in need. And we know we probably should help our neighbor in need, right? We all know that's a good idea. It's something we want to be a part of, but it just seems so hard. Like, why is it so easy to ignore a neighbor in need? The truth is, like we said, we're tired. We don't have much margin in our lives. Our families, we have needs of our own. There's so many reasons why we feel like we can't help. We feel like we can't really make an impact. It's just too big. How could I really make a difference? But one day, Jesus was having a conversation with a religious expert about the greatest commandment, which is to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And it brought up this question: who is my neighbor? How far do I need to go? Here's what he's saying. What is the proximity of people that I need to love? And in response to this question, Jesus is about to tell a story that takes away our ability to believe that we can't make an impact. And it's not just for Christians either. This is for non-Jesus followers as well, because the star of this story that he's about to tell is a very unexpected character. And so if you've ever felt like an outsider in church, you're in good company today, because the hero of today's story you might be able to relate to. But let me just ask this. Who's ever heard of like a Good Samaritan? Who's ever heard someone say that? Good Samaritan. Yeah, like probably all of us, right? We've heard someone say that phrase, oh, they were such a good Samaritan. Typically, we use this to describe someone who's done a good thing, right? You're a good Samaritan. You're doing something great. We're really proud of you. You're such a good Samaritan, right? There's even nonprofit organizations that use the word Samaritan in their name because of this idea, all of it around the idea of being a good person. And interestingly enough, if you didn't know, we get that phrase from Jesus. It's one of the most famous stories that Jesus ever told. so much so that it's still impacting our culture today. And so we're going to look at this story. It starts in Luke chapter 10, and here's how this conversation begins. It says this: On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" Jesus replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength and with all of your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." This religious expert, he stands up to ask Jesus what the most important command is. And Jesus has answered this question before. Jesus answers his question, though, with a question of his own. He wants to know how you would answer this question. And so this religious teacher has obviously heard Jesus teach before, because he answers Jesus' question the same way that Jesus answered this question previously: to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, your strength, and your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And when Jesus taught this, he wasn't just saying these are good ideas or these are good things for you to do or you should start putting these in the rotation. He's saying, no, if you are a follower of Jesus, these are equally the greatest commands. These are the most important commands for a follower of Jesus to live by: to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And somehow loving God and loving our neighbor are deeply connected. That if you aren't loving your neighbor as yourself, then you aren't loving God with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind. These two go hand in hand. And so Jesus commends the religious expert. He says, yeah, well done. You nailed it. I gave you a little test. You passed. But he wasn't done. The religious expert, remember, it says that he stood up to test Jesus. And so he has another question. And it says this in the next verse: but he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" He says, yeah, Jesus, I get that. I've heard you teach this before. I already know this. Loving God, loving my neighbor, they're connected. Great idea. I love it. I'm a big fan. But who is my neighbor? He wants to know, what is the proximity that I have to go? And here's what he really wants to know. What is the minimum requirement? What is the minimum amount of neighbor loving required to keep God happy? What is the bare minimum neighbor loving I have to do, Jesus, to keep God happy? Now, we would never say this out loud, but we ask this question too. Right? We want to know, what is the minimum that I have to do? Jesus, what is the bare minimum I have to do to keep God happy? How much is enough when it comes to loving others? What is the proximity that I have to achieve to make sure that my relationship with God is okay? What is the bare minimum? And even if you aren't a Jesus follower, you ask a version of this question. You ask, what is the minimum amount of neighbor loving required to keep me happy or to keep my conscience clear? We all ask this: what is the bare minimum when it comes to loving my neighbor? And to answer that question, Jesus enters into what I believe is probably the most disorienting, culture-shifting, groundbreaking story that he ever told. I mean, we're all familiar with the idea of a Good Samaritan, and it's part of our culture 2,000 years later. But in this story Jesus tells, the Good Samaritan isn't just about being a good person. It's far more than that. And I think many of us have simplified this amazing and disorienting story down to this idea of simply being a good person. But I really want us to look at it with fresh eyes today. Because even me, as I was writing this message the last 2 weeks, I found myself saying like, oh yeah, I know this story. It's a Good Samaritan. Yeah, I know. And as I looked at it, as I read through it, I was just in awe of the magnitude. I was blown away by what Jesus really said in this story. And I don't want us to miss it. So I want to ask you, as we read through this story that Jesus tells, I want you to look at it with fresh eyes, because the story Jesus told changed his culture. And if we really did what Jesus is saying, it would change our world today too. And so here's how Jesus answered that question: who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. The audience hears Jesus begin to tell the story, to answer this question. They're thinking, wait, Jesus, we asked you a simple question. Who's my neighbor? And now you're talking about this guy who got attacked. Like, I don't know what you're doing. We asked a simple question. We just want the simple answer. And then you tell us this story that has nothing to do with what we were talking about. Jesus, I just need to know. Does loving my neighbor mean my next door neighbor? Or is it like everyone in my neighborhood? Just tell me the answer. And the disciples were like, yeah, guys, just hang on. He does this. We don't always get it either, but just hang in there. It'll make sense in a little bit, maybe. And so right off the bat, the man is attacked while going down this very dangerous road. And they beat him, they rob him, and they leave him half dead. The first two people to walk by, they see this dying man, are actually a priest and a Levite. So basically two priests. And here's how they respond in 31 and 32. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and we saw the man he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. Now we read this, and that kind of sounds messed up. We're like, what are they doing? Two religious leaders walk by this man who's half dead, and they go to the other side of the road, and they do nothing about it. But here's what's interesting. The priests had every reason not to help this man. Because of Jewish ceremonial cleanliness laws, if they touched a dead body, they would be ritually unclean for 7 days. That means they wouldn't be able to do their job for an entire week because they touched a dead body. So when they see this man laying half dead on the side of the road, they think, well, what if he's already dead? What if I stop to help and he dies while I'm helping him? And then an entire week, I can't do what I need to do to help other people experience God. And so they have every reason to go around, because if they had done this and he had died, they wouldn't be able to fulfill their duties as a priest. And so everyone in the audience, they know this, and it makes sense to them. It may not be the best look, but they can rationalize it. But Jesus does something really crazy next. He introduces a third character, and this man is a Samaritan. Now, the Jews and the Samaritans, they do not get along at all. There's very serious racial tension between these two people groups. When the Assyrians invaded Samaria, the Samaritan Jews there began having children with the Assyrians, and the Jews looked down on them for this, and they became enemies. They actually hated each other because of this. Not to mention, just 20 years before Jesus taught this very story, some Samaritans broke into the Jewish Passover festival, and they left the remains of dead bodies all over the Jewish temple, ruining the festival and making everyone who had to clean it up ritually unclean. This would have happened in Jesus' lifetime, and many of the people sitting and listening to the story, they know this led to heightened tension in this feud between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans were banned from attending Jewish temples. They were banned from entering the temple and coming to festivals. Like, the tension between these two people groups were very high at the time. And so when Jesus says, but now a Samaritan comes along, everyone in the audience thinks like, please don't do this. Like, Jesus, like anyone but them, this cannot be the hero of the story. But Jesus continues, and he says this in 33. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and we saw him. He took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, then put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. He said, look after them, and I will return. I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have. And the Samaritan man, an enemy to this man in need, went above and beyond to meet the needs of this man laying on the side of the road. And he didn't just help, he met all of the man's needs, and then some. And then he offered to pay for it. And the priests, they looked at this man in need, and they asked themselves, why should I help? Why would I help? It's going to inconvenience me. It could mess up my entire week. I have so much going on. I have so much to think about, so much to worry about. But the Samaritan looked at the man in need and asked, why wouldn't I help? Jesus shows that there's a difference. There's something intentional about the Samaritan's reaction, because you don't accidentally love your neighbor. It's a lifestyle. It's a habit. It's something that you put into practice in your own life. And the priests in the story, they're not bad guys, but they didn't build their life in a way that allowed for them to love their neighbors. And I bet those priests had plenty of moments of generosity in their own lives, but their lifestyle didn't revolve around prioritizing generosity and loving their neighbor as themselves. And when it comes to loving our neighbor as ourselves, I believe that's where many of us are as well. We haven't built our life in a way that allows us to love our neighbor. Instead, we have all the reasons not to help. But if you've maxed out your calendar, if you've maxed out your finances, if you've maxed out your energy, you'll never find room to be inconvenienced by your neighbor. And Jesus wants us to know that if anything prevents us from loving our neighbor, whether it's our schedule, our finances, even our religion, then we aren't loving God with all of our heart, our soul, our strength, and our mind. The goal of this is not to make you feel guilty, but like Jesus did, to invite you into something bigger where we experience God's love in a greater way by connecting our love for Him to our love for the people around us. Because we've experienced this like the priests. We've seen someone on the side of the road. We've seen someone in need. We feel compassion. We have this desire to help. But as soon as we feel it, we're reminded of all the reasons we can't or we shouldn't or it doesn't make sense. We talk ourselves out of it because it might be awkward or what if we can't meet their needs? And so we decide to do nothing instead. And so why didn't Jesus just answer this question to begin with? That's what I want to know. Why didn't Jesus just tell them, everyone is your neighbor? Why did he tell this whole story? Because I believe this, he didn't want to just give us the minimum requirement, but instead he wanted to inspire us to be a part of something great. And after he tells this story, he changes the conversation again, and this is what he says next. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And remember, the real question behind all of this was, what is the minimum amount of neighbor loving required of me to keep God happy? And Jesus completely changes this conversation from proximity to priority. Our priorities will determine our pathway. That when we prioritize someone in need, instead of walking around them, we're going to be led straight to them. We're going to be more like the Samaritan who looked at him and said, I can't walk around this man, because we all have things going on in our life. We all have excuses of why we can't help. And if we don't prioritize someone else in need, we're going to let those excuses keep us from helping and allow us to walk around. But our priorities will determine the path that we take. It's not about the bare minimum that I can do. Instead, it's a lifestyle that Jesus invites us to that embraces prioritizing the needs of other people around us. And it says this, that if someone has a need that I could potentially meet, that person becomes my neighbor. And so what about you? Are you prioritizing someone in need? Are you prioritizing their needs above your own? Are you being intentional about meeting the needs of the people around you? Because back to our original idea, it's easy to ignore a neighbor in need. You have every reason not to help. But Jesus teaches a new way, a different way, a very disorienting, culture-shifting way. But the story of the Good Samaritan shows us that intentionality creates impact. That if you want to make a lasting impact, it starts with prioritizing other people's needs above your own. It requires being intentional about seeing their need and meeting that need. It's when we orient our lives in such a way that we really get to make a difference. And when we have the chance here to impact our community. We have a chance to endear Church at the Creek to our community by meeting their needs through our time and resources. And the truth is, this seems big. Like, this almost seems overwhelming or impossible to do. But it's not as complicated as you might think. I get to see this firsthand Like I mentioned yesterday, we went to Mission Arlington with our students. This is actually the second time we've gone there. And over the summer, we took a 3-day trip with some of our students on a local mission trip. One of the things Mission Arlington does is over the summer, they know that there's a lot of kids at home in apartment complexes and their parents have to work. And so they're left at home during the day. And so they send church groups to go knock on doors and say, hey, we're with Mission Arlington. Do you want to come play with us? And they send us with some games, some coloring activities, and a Bible story to lead. And so we go, we bring them some lunch. We plan for a couple students to lead a Bible study and a game. And then we just get to hang out and have so much fun with them. And it's awesome. And one of these days, 3 of our high school girls were sitting around talking to 4 girls from this apartment complex, having lunch with them and just talking about them. And one of the girls in that group was supposed to lead our game and our Bible study. And so we're ready to get started. So I go over there. I was like, hey, come on, we're getting going. She's like, okay, cool. And then she just turned back around and went back to her conversation. I was like, oh, maybe she didn't hear me. We're starting now, so you should come over here. And she's like, okay, cool. I'll be there in a second. And I started to get frustrated. I was like, okay, we are starting now. So I need you to come over here and lead this game of sharks and minnows. And if you can't do it, I'll find someone else. I was getting mad. I was like, what are they doing? They're just ignoring me. It wasn't until after that I found out the whole story, that after our high school girls fed them, they began meeting other needs for these girls. They began talking to them about some of the really hard things that they have going on in their own lives. And these 4 girls began to open up about their home situations. And our students sat there with them and shared their own stories and their own experiences. And they prioritized the right thing. And in doing so, they shared the gospel with these 4 girls. And I was so worried about this Bible program, a good thing, that I missed out on the need, which is the best thing in that moment. And I'm so grateful for these high school girls who didn't miss it, who prioritized the right thing by sharing the love of God, by loving their neighbor. And in doing so, 2 of those girls decided to follow Jesus that day. It was amazing. It's such an incredible moment. It was. And it's not this grand action that our high school girls did. They may not even known they were doing it, but they knew they were prioritizing the right thing. It's amazing. And so a simple decision can put you on the path of loving your neighbor as yourself. And so I want to give you just 2 simple things that we can start doing today that will help us to be a good neighbor. The first is to just evaluate, have you been a good neighbor? I want to give you a very simple definition of a good neighbor based on what we saw in this passage, because Jesus asked, who was the neighbor? And in this passage, here's who it was. A neighbor was someone who saw a need. The first step was just seeing the need, but multiple people saw the need. The good neighbor was the one who intentionally and sacrificially met that need. And so simply our definition is of a good neighbor is someone who saw a need and met that need. And so if a neighbor is defined that way, who would call you their neighbor? And that's a tough question for me to answer because I don't know who in my life would describe me that way. And as I've been preparing for this message, I've personally been convicted that I don't know if I've been prioritizing the right things. And I've been starting to take steps to intentionally reorient my life to make space that allows me to meet the needs of other people. And I hope you would consider doing the same. So ask yourself that question. Who would call you their neighbor? And the second step is this, and I don't want to use my own words. I want to use the words of Jesus. Because that last little bit we read, there's just one more sentence to it. And I want you to see all of it. You remember Jesus says this, which of these 3 do you think was the man or was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law said, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. And so to you, go and do likewise. Through this Outside the Walls season, you guys have been amazing. We've already cleared the list. We've already taken home all the food boxes, but there's still more needs to be met in our community. As Sean mentioned earlier, we've got shoes for kids and teens. We've got razors and shampoo. We've got service projects coming up. So go and do likewise. Look for a need and meet it. Selfishly, for me, as the student pastor, once a month we feed our student ministry dinner at our Inside Out events, and we ask small groups or individuals to provide those meals for about 50 people. And so if that's something that you would be interested in, a need that you would be interested in, we've seen how powerful it is when students get to share meals together. And so if that's something you'd be interested in, you can get some more information. That's my email, Ben, that's my name, at churchofthecreek.com. That's where I work.com. You can email me, and I will give you all the information you need for that once a month if that's something you'd be interested in. And that might sound simple, but again, I've seen just how impactful that can be. And so all month long, we're going to show you a need. But we're also asking for you to look for needs and create margin in your life to meet those needs. Like, what would it look like if you began to serve with these organizations that we're talking about, not just in November, but all year long? What would it look like if you went and did likewise with your small group and picked an organization that you said, every month we're here? What if you and your friends begin to say, we're going to go and do likewise together? What would it look like if you and your family decided this is a way that we can serve together? This is a way we can go and do likewise. And as we endear church at the Creek to our community, I hope for the day that people drive by our new campus and they look at our building and say, I may not believe what these people believe, but I sure am glad they're here. Because we have a chance to be a part of something amazing, restoring the reputation of churches in our county by living out Jesus' message that God is for you, and so are we. And here's why we do this. As Mark shared last week out of Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. This is what Jesus says, and this is how I'll close. It's amazing. Just look at these words. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Would you pray with me? Father, I'm so grateful and blown away that you care for us so much, that the way that we treat each other matters to you. Lord, help us to love our neighbor with all of our heart and our soul and our strength and our mind. Help us to be intentional so that we can make an impact in our community, so that people may see it and give glory to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.